everyone, welcome back to our channel, The Ultimate Audiobook. Today we will complete this theme too. So let's begin with Urbanization in Southern Mesopotamia, Temples and Kings. From 5000 BCE, settlements had begun to develop in southern Mesopotamia. The earliest cities emerged from some of these settlements. These were of various kinds. Those that gradually developed around temples, those that developed as centers of trade, and imperial cities. It is cities of the first two kinds that will be discussed here. Early settlers, their origins are unknown, began to build and rebuild temples at selected spots in their villages. The earliest known temple was a small shrine made of unbaked bricks. Temples were the residences of various gods, of the moon god of Ur, or of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Constructed in brick, temples became larger over time, with several rooms around open courtyards. Some of the early ones were possibly not unlike the ordinary house, for the temple was the house of a god. But temples always had their outer walls going in and out at regular intervals, which no ordinary building ever had. The god was the focus of worship. To him or her, people brought grain, cod, and fish. The floors of some early temples had thick layers of fish bones. The god was also the theoretical owner of the agricultural fields, the fisheries, and the herds of the local community. In time, the processing of produce, for example oil pressing, grain grinding, spinning, and the weaving of woolen cloths, was also done in the temple. Organizer of production at a level above the household, employer of merchants, and keeper of written records of distributions and allotments of grain, plough animals, bread, beer, fish, etc., the temple gradually developed its activities and became the main urban institution. But there was also another factor on the scene. In spite of natural fertility, agriculture was subject to hazards. The natural outlet channels of the Euphrates would have too much water one year and flood the crops, and sometimes they would change course altogether. As the archaeological record shows, villages were periodically relocated in Mesopotamian history. There were man-made problems as well. Those who lived on the upstream stretches of a channel could divert so much water into their fields that villages downstream were left without water. Or they could neglect to clean out the silt from their stretch of the channel, blocking the flow of water further down. So the early Mesopotamian countryside saw repeated conflict over land and water. When there was continuous warfare in a region, those chiefs who had been successful in war could oblige their followers by distributing the loot and could take prisoners from the defeated groups to employ as their guards or servants. So they could increase their influence and clout. Such war leaders, however, would be here today and gone tomorrow, until a time came when such leadership came to increase the well-being of the community with the creation of new institutions or practices. In time, victorious chiefs began to offer precious booty to the gods and thus beautify the community's temple. They would send men out to fetch fine stones and metal for the benefit of the god, and community and organize the distribution of temple wealth in an efficient way by accounting for things that came in and went out. As the poem about Enmerkar shows, this gave the king high status and the authority to command the community. We can imagine a mutually reinforcing cycle of development in which leaders encourage the settlement of villages close to themselves to be able to rapidly get an army together. Besides, people would be safe living in close proximity to one another. At Uruk, one of the earliest temple towns, we find depictions of armed heroes and their victims and careful archaeological surveys have shown that around 3000 BCE, when Uruk grew to the enormous extent of 250 hectares, twice as large as Mohenjo-daro would be in later centuries, dozens of small villages were deserted. There had been a major population shift. Significantly, Uruk also came to have a defensive wall at a very early date. The site was continuously occupied from about 4200 BCE to about 400 CE, and by about 2800 BCE it had expanded to 400 hectares. War captives and local people were put to work for the temple directly for the ruler. This, rather than agricultural tax, was compulsory. Those who were put to work were paid rations. Hundreds of ration lists have been found which give against people's names the quantities of grain, cloth, or oil allotted to them. It has been estimated that one of the temples took 1500 men working 10 hours a day, 5 years to build. With rulers commanding people to fetch stones or metal ores, to come and make bricks or lay the bricks for a temple, or else to go to a distant country to fetch suitable materials, there were also technical advances at Uruk around 3000 BC. Bronze tools came into use for various crafts. Architects learned to construct brick columns, there being no suitable wood to bear the weight of the roof of large halls. Hundreds of people were put to work at making and baking clay cones that could be pushed into temple walls, painted in different colors, creating a colorful mosaic. In sculpture, there were superb achievements not in easily available clay but in imported stone. And then there was a technological landmark that we can say is appropriate to an urban economy, the potter's wheel. In the long run, the wheel enables a potter's workshop to mass produce dozens of similar pots at a time. The seal, an urban artifact. In India, easily stone seals were stamped. In Mesopotamia, until the end of the first millennium BCE, cylindrical stone seals, pierced down the center, were fitted with a stick and rolled over wet clay so that a continuous picture was created. They were carved by very skilled craftsmen and sometimes carry writing, the name of the owner, his god, his official position, etc. A seal could be rolled on clay covering the string knot of a cloth package or the mouth of a pot, keeping the contents safe. When rolled on a letter written on a clay tablet, it became a mark of authenticity. So the seal was a mark of a city dweller's role in public life. Life in the city. What we have seen is that a ruling elite had emerged. A small section of society had a major share of the wealth. Nothing makes this fact as clear as the enormous riches, jewelry, gold vessels, wooden musical instruments inlaid with white shale and lapis lazuli, ceremonial daggers of gold, etc., buried with some kings and queens at Ur. But what of the ordinary people? We know from the legal texts, disputes, inheritance matters, etc., that in Mesopotamian society, the nuclear family was the norm, although a married son and his family often resided with his parents. The father was a head of the family. We know a little about the procedures for marriage. A declaration was made about the willingness to marry, the bride's parents giving their consent to the marriage. Then a gift was given by the groom's people to the brides. people. When the wedding took place, gifts were exchanged by both parties, who ate together and made offerings in a temple. When her mother-in-law came to fetch her, the bride was given her share of the inheritance by her father. The father's house, herds, fields, etc. were inherited by the sons. Let us look at Ur, one of the earliest cities to have been excavated. Ur was a town whose ordinary houses were systematically excavated in the 1930s. Narrow, winding streets indicate that wheeled carts couldn't have reached many of the houses. Sacks of grain and firewood would have arrived on donkey back. Narrow, winding streets and the irregular shapes of house plots also indicate an absence of town planning. There were no street drains of the kind we find in contemporary Mohenjo-daro. Drains and clay pipes were instead found in the inner courtyards of the Ur houses. And it is thought that house roofs sloped inwards and rainwater was channeled via the drain pipes into sumps in the inner courtyards. This would have been a way of preventing the unpaved streets from becoming excessively slushy after a downpour. Yet people seem to have swept all their household refuse into the streets, to be trodden underfoot. This made street levels rise, and over time the thresholds of houses had also to be raised so that no mud would flow inside after the rains. Light came into the rooms, not from windows but from doorways opening into the courtyards. This would also have given families their privacy. There were superstitions about houses recorded in omen tablets at Ur. A raised threshold brought wealth. A front door that didn't open towards another house was lucky. But if the main wooden door of a house opened outwards instead of inwards, the wife would be a torment to her husband. There was a town cemetery at Ur in which the graves of royalty and commoners have been found, but a few individuals were found buried under the floors of ordinary houses. A trading town in a pastoral zone. After 2000 BCE, the royal capital of Mari flourished. You will have noticed that Mari stands not on the southern plain with its highly productive agriculture, but much further upstream on the Euphrates. Map 3 with its color coding shows that agriculture and animal rearing were carried out close to each other in this region. Some communities in the kingdom of Mari had both farmers and pastoralists, but most of its territory was used for pasturing sheep and goats. Herders need to exchange young animals, cheese, leather, and meat in return for grain, metal tools, etc. And the manure of a penned flock is also of great use to a farmer. Yet at the same time, there may be conflict. A shepherd may take his flock to water across a sown field to the ruin of the crop. Herdsmen, being mobile, can raid agricultural villages and seize their stored goods. For their part, settled groups may deny pastoralists access to river and canal water along a certain set of paths. Through Mesopotamian history, nomadic communities of the Western Desert filtered into the prosperous agricultural heartland. Shepherds would bring their flocks into the sown area in the summer. Such groups would come in as herders, harvest laborers, or hired soldiers, occasionally become prosperous and settle down. A few gained the power to establish their own rule. These included the Akkadians, Amorites, Assyrians, and Armenians and Arameans. You will read more about rulers from pastoral societies in Theme 5. The kings of Mari were Amorites, whose dress differed from that of the original inhabitants and who respected not only the gods of Mesopotamia but also raised a temple at Mari for Dagan, god of the steppe. Mesopotamian society and culture were thus open to different people and cultures, and the vitality of the civilization was perhaps due to this intermixture. The palace at Mari of King Jimrilim. The great palace of Mari was the residence of the royal family, the hub of administration, and a place of production, especially of precious metal ornaments. It was so famous in its time that a minor king came from North Syria just to see it, carrying with him a letter of introduction from a royal friend of the king of Mari, Jimrilim. Daily lists reveal that huge quantities of food were presented each day for the king's table. Flour, bread, meat, fish, fruit, beer, and wine. He probably ate in the company of many others. In or around courtyard 106, paved white. You will notice from the plan that the palace had only one entrance, on the north. The large open courtyards, such as 131, were beautifully paved. The king would have received foreign dignitaries and his own people in 132, a room with wall paintings that would have awed the visitors. The palace was a sprawling structure with 260 rooms and covered an area of 2.4 hectares. The kings of Mari, however, had to be vigilant. Herders of various tribes were allowed to move in the kingdom, but they were watched. The camps of herders are mentioned frequently in letters between kings and officials. In one letter, an officer writes to the king that he has been seeing frequent fire signals at night, sent by one camp to another, and he suspects that a raid or an attack is being planned. Located on the Euphrates in a prime position for trade, in wood, copper, tin, oil, wine, and various other goods that were carried in boats along the Euphrates between the south and the mineral-rich uplands of Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon. Mari is a good example of an urban center prospering on trade. Boats carrying grinding stones, wood, and wine and oil jars would stop at Mari on their way to the southern cities. Officers of this town would go aboard. Officers of this town would go aboard, inspect the cargo. A single river boat could hold 300 wine jars and levy a charge of about 1/10 the value of the goods before allowing the boat to continue downstream. Barley came in special grain boats. Most important, tablets refer to copper from Alasia, the island of Cyprus, known for its copper, and tin was also an item of trade. As bronze was the main industrial material for tools and weapons, this trade was of great importance. Thus, although the kingdom of Mari was not militarily strong, it was exceptionally prosperous. Excavating Mesopotamian towns. Today, Mesopotamian excavators have much higher standards of accuracy and care in recording than in the old days. so that few dig huge areas the way Ur was excavated. Moreover, few archaeologists had the funds to employ large teams of excavators. Thus, the mode of obtaining data had changed. Take the small town at Abu Salabik, about 10 hectares in area in 2500 BCE, with a population less than 10,000. The outlines of walls were at first traced by scraping surfaces. This involves scraping off the top few millimeters of the mound with the sharp and wide end of a shovel or other tool. While the soil underneath was still slightly moist, the archaeologists could make out different colors, textures, and lines of brick walls or pits or other features. A few houses that were discovered were excavated. The archaeologists also sieved through tons of earth to recover plant and animal remains, and in the process identified many species of plants and animals and found large quantities of charred fish bones that had been swept out onto the streets. Plant seeds and fiber remained after dung cakes had been burned as fuel, and thus kitchens were identified. Living rooms were those with few traces. Because they found the teeth of very young pigs on the streets, archaeologists concluded that pigs must have roamed freely here as in any other Mesopotamian town. In fact, one house burial contained some pig bones. The dead person must have been given some pork for his nourishment in the afterlife. The archaeologists also made microscopic studies of room floors to decide which rooms in a house were roofed with poplar logs, palm leaves, straw, etc., and which were open to the sky. Cities in Mesopotamian culture. Mesopotamians valued city life in which people of many communities and cultures lived side by side. After cities were destroyed in war, they recalled them in poetry. The most poignant reminder to us of the pride Mesopotamians took in their cities comes at the end of the Gilgamesh Epic, which was written on 12 tablets. Gilgamesh is said to have ruled the city of Uruk sometime after Enmerkar, a great hero who subdued people far and wide. He got a shock when his heroic friend died. He then set out to find the secret of immortality, crossing the waters that surround the world. After a heroic attempt, Gilgamesh failed and returned to Uruk. There he consoled himself by walking along the city wall back and forth. He admired the foundations made of fired bricks that he had put into place. It is on the city wall of Uruk that the long tale of heroism and endeavor fizzles out. Gilgamesh doesn't say that, even though he will die, his sons will outlive him, as a tribal hero would have done. He takes consolation in the city that his people had built. The legacy of writing. While moving narratives can be transmitted orally, science requires written texts that generations of scholars can read and build upon. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Mesopotamia to the world is its scholarly tradition of time reckoning and mathematics. Dating around 1800 BCE are tablets with multiplication and division tables, square and square root tables, and tables of compound interest. The square roots of 2 was given as 1 plus 24 upon 60 plus 51 upon 60 to the power 2 plus 10 upon 60 to the power 3. If you work this out, you will find that the answer is 1.41421296, only slightly different from the correct answer 1.41421,356. Students had to solve problems such as the following. A field of area such and such is covered, 1 finger deep in water. Find out the volume of water. The division of the year into 12 months according to the revolution of the moon around the earth. The division of the month into 4 weeks. The day into 24 hours. And the hour into 60 minutes. All that we take for granted in our daily lives has come to us from the Mesopotamians. These time divisions were adopted by the successors of Alexander and from there transmitted to the Roman world, then to the world of Islam, and then to medieval Europe. Wherever solar and lunar eclipses were observed, their occurrence was noted according to year, month, and day. So too, there were records about the observed positions of stars and constellations in the night sky. None of these momentous Mesopotamian achievements would have been possible without writing and the urban institution of schools, where students read and copied earlier written tablets, and where some boys were trained to become not record keepers for the administration, but intellectuals who could build on the work of their predecessors. We would be mistaken if we think that the preoccupation with the urban world of Mesopotamia is a modern phenomenon. Exercises. Answer in brief. Number 1. Why do we say that it was not natural fertility and high levels of food production that were the causes of early urbanization? Number 2. Which of the following were necessary conditions and which the causes of early urbanization and which would you say were the outcome of the growth of cities? A. Highly productive agriculture. B. Water transport. C. The lack of metal and stone. D. The division of labor. E. The use of sails. F. The military power of kings that made labor compulsory. Number 3. Why were mobile animal herders not necessarily a threat to town life? Number 4. Why would the early temple have been much like a house? Answer in a short essay. Number 5. Of the new institutions that came into being once city life had begun, which would have depended on the initiative of the king. Number 6. What do ancient stories tell us about the civilization of Mesopotamia? So now everyone, we have completed the Sim 2. I hope this audiobook will definitely help you. I'll meet you with a new chapter. Till then, take care and bye bye everyone.